Hi, I'm Nelson, and I'm really happy to be here today. It's our pleasure to present today our research paper regarding the case study of Capital One data breach. With me, I have my partner and Chris Moraes that work together to write this paper and this research. During all the presentation, feel free to ask any question. That will be my pleasure, our pleasure to answer that for you. So, to compose this study, we have four main steps for that. The first one is the research goal. And the research goal is, are compliance controls and cybersecurity legislation sufficient to prevent Capital One's data breach incident? This is one important question of the main question of this study. The second point is the methodological considerations. Here, we define and we get all information regarding technical and trustworthy information regarding the detail of the incidents and which regulation were applied in that specific moment of the incident. The third point here, we have a detailed analysis regarding the Capital One incident. How is the modus operandi of the attack and what conditions allow the breach and the related mitigatory controls that could avoid this incident. And in the end, the fourth step, we have the discussion, recommendation, and conclusion. So the research goals. Here we have the Capital One case that Capital One is one of the biggest banks around the world. In one specific and curious point regarding this incident is that we have online extensive technical reports that are public and available. It is really difficult to find a lot of technical reports regarding cybersecurity incidents. And in this case, Capital One suffered a data breach that impacted more than 100 million customers, and the shares fell around 6% after the breach. And Capital One has a curious story, and that it was the first bank in the world to migrate their on-premise data centers to a cloud computer environment. So the main research goals and the questions of these studies are, first of all, understand the Capital One data breach incident. With this analysis, we can understand a lot of information and the techniques regarding what happened and the details of the breach and what happened in this specific incident. And the most important question here, were compliance controls and cybersecurity legislation sufficient to prevent the Capital One data breach? So to do this, we have some methodological considerations that are important to drive us to have a complete vision of what happened and the suggestion to help this scenario. So here we have the current scenarios that data leaks cases in large institutions did not result to minimize the occurrence of leaks. As we can see in this new research paper, the number of the data records breach increased from 4.1 billion of records in 2018 to 22 billion records in 2019. It's an expressive data leaks number that are coming every year, and we don't see any result to minimize this kind of occurrence. So the initial hypothesis of this study was, first of all, global regulations and the laws on cybersecurity do not provide a proper guidance nor protection to avoid new data leak incidents. Or the institution, in this case, Capital One, were deficient in managing the controls required by existing regulations. So one more important criteria for this study and in the methodological point, we needed to understand the modus operandi of the attack and what kind of regulation was applied to Capital One in that specific moment. To cover that, we took the decision to use the MIT, ATT-ACK, just to understand this is a framework that help you to map the tactics, techniques, and the procedure of a cybersecurity attack. And to understand what is control failed, we have here the NIST cybersecurity framework. This framework is applied as a mandatory cybersecurity banking regulation in US. That's why we are using NIST, that is covering a lot of ways to protect your systems and information. So we have the ways in the domains to identify, to protect, to detect, to respond, and to recover a specific incident. So now let's cover a little bit about the Capital One incident.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anquises. I worked with Nelson building the paper. So we will discuss a little bit about the Capital One incident, data breach incident that took place in 2019. So first of all, by March 2019, the attacker, Ms. Paige Thompson, a former Amazon employee, she had the initial access to the Capital One infrastructure hosted at AWS servers. And then on April, about a month later, on April 21, she had access to more than 700 S3 buckets with Capital One customer data, okay? And then she started installing the data. However, just about 3 months later, on July, Capital One realized that the incident took place because actually it was not detected by their own regular cybersecurity operations. They received a report through a Noticeable Outsider via their vulnerability report program that something weird was happening, and then they started the investigation, and on July 19, the Capital One went public about the incident, which means that it took about 4 months between the initial attacker access to the network to Capital One identifying the attack and releasing a report about going public about the incident, okay? It's way too much time. And just summarizing how the attack took place, we have a plenty of literature on the internet. We have a FBI report detailing how the attack worked. So initially, Ms. Paige Thompson, she was using Tor network and both IP Predator VPN to hide her access to the network infrastructure and then hide the original IP address. She had built previously a script to scan AWS servers and looking for a specific web application firewall vulnerability. And then by running this script, actually she attacked almost 30 companies according to the US Department of Justice. And one of the companies was Capital One, unfortunately. And then by running this script, she was able to figure out that Capital One had a misconfigured web application firewall. And then she ran a server-side request forgery attack in order to relay specific commands to internal servers hosted at Amazon infrastructure. By doing so, she was able to access a server and get access to internal credentials, and by then having access to internal servers at all. After she gained access to the servers, she was able to run command line commands in the Capital One infrastructure, including a command to list the entire list of buckets that Capital One had, and later a command to sync, to copy the data from the bucket to her computer. And by doing so, is stealing Capital One internal and proprietary data, which includes nearly 30 gigabytes of Capital One data. So in a nutshell, this is how the attack worked. In our paper, we have a more detailed description of each steps of the attack, okay? So as we explained before, in our paper, we took each step of the attack and mapped it to a military attack framework, and then based on that mapping, we went to NIST framework, and we look for each one of the specific NIST controls that would apply to that specific particular attack step. By doing so, we are able to, again, to map a plenty of NIST controls that would help preventing each step of the attack. Okay, I will not go in details for each one, but we can see that there's a lot of controls that could help preventing the attack in determinate point of time. Actually, we figure out that there are 61 potential NIST controls that would help preventing the attack to happen, okay, at any stage of the attack. Obviously, not some of the controls are similar because they apply to different steps of the attack, okay? But if you're thinking from the technical perspective, even as the fact that the control is a similar one from the NIST perspective, the technical control, the technical measure usually is different. So you apply the same concept to different stage, to different technical measure, okay? If we see the most frequent, the most usual controls that we mapped, most of them were related to lack of proper vulnerability management. Some of them were related to not implementing some sort of least privilege principle that helped the attacker getting access even more that we wanted to. We have lack of security event monitoring as well. This is the reason why the attacker goes unnoticed through almost 4 months, okay? And also security principles are all that failed. Just an example, if we pick just one stage of the attack when Paige Thompson exploited the web application firewall vulnerability to gain access to the Capital One infrastructure, we had 7 controls that might be in place that would have preventing the attack to happen. For example, the lack of vulnerability management plan properly developed to help mitigating SSRF attack, lack of audit log records that would help Capital One monitoring what's happening in the infrastructure and detecting the attack, or like the principle of least functionality was not implemented in the web application firewall configuration. For instance, it seems that some data was not collected and monitored to help Capital One detecting the incident while it's happening. Okay, even the lack of monitoring for unauthorized access to the infrastructure. And from the preventive perspective, we understand that there was a lack of vulnerability scans happening on a proper frequency that would help Capital One detect the misconfiguration in the web application firewall prior to the incident. And last but not least, we understand that there's a fail in the control related to the detection activities should comply with the security needs, okay? So this is just one example in one particular stage of the attack. And we understand that based on the Office of Comptroller of the Currency report that is the US authority that build a report regarding the attack and help the authorities to understand the incident and end up finding the Capital One. Their final report, it's very similar to our finds in our research. So they understood that Capital One had issues with the risk assessment process, okay? They have issues with the risk management process at all. Their internal audits team failed to detect the vulnerabilities prior the incident and did not effectively report the vulnerabilities to the technical team in order to fix them. And last but not least, the OCC understood that the management team was accountable because of this lack of proper risk assessment, vulnerability management, and reporting. And all of this contribute to the weakness in the Capital One environment that led to the breach. So we understood that Capital One really failed in having a proper risk management process. So we had plenty of, as we show, we have plenty of these controls that have prevented the attack to happen. But even though the attack happened, which means that Capital One really failed to implement the proper mitigatory controls to avoid the incident. From our study, we had some key points to discuss that we'd like to share with you. So first of all, we understand that whenever you have a regulation, companies have the flexibility to decide which control is required or not based on the environment, on their risk posture, or the risk scenario, okay? So we have such flexibility. It's something that really takes part of all the regulatory bodies, okay? So it's not something just written on stone. So we have the companies have the possibility to adapt the controls to their reality. This is a good point, okay? So it helps company to adapt the regulatory requirements to the environment, but it also has an issue, okay? We have the risk of having specific regulatory controls that the company just decides to not apply, and even though they were important. So companies have to take too much care on really deciding which controls apply or not to the environments, okay? So for example, focusing on security best practices, focusing on access control and least privilege, etc. So we have a lot of controls that are like security principles that we have to follow, okay? The second point that we'd like to discuss is that the companies have consistent compliance and risk management across different parts of the organization and across different infrastructures, different technical infrastructures that they have. So we usually work with 3 lines of the defense, so the people more close to the infrastructure, from the managers, and we need to have these 3 lines of defense talking with each other, okay, and having them very well aligned about what are the risk posture. But more important than that, we have to really understand and adapt our regulatory controls to different technical environments. In this particular case, we have to really, and people are usually very well used to work with security in on-premise, in traditional on-premise environments. But whenever you move to a cloud environment, sometimes people are not so well adapted. So we have to, as much as possible, have the same security principles that we use on our on-premise environments, also covered in our cloud environments. So we have to understand the difference between the different technological frameworks, the different technological infrastructures, and adapt our security posture, our security needs to them. And last but not least, during our research, we realized that there's an issue with the Capital One cybersecurity team. Human error might take part of this cause. Why? Because we realized that the Capital One, in the beginning, they built a very solid cybersecurity team, very well technically capable on running on cloud environments. But all of a sudden, they changed their leadership, and the new person that took the leadership had issues with the current cybersecurity team, different cultures, and then as a result, it emerged a toxic culture in the cybersecurity team of Capital One. And they faced a high turnover, which means in just 1 year, in 2018, they lost 1/3 of their employees. It's a lot of people. Can you imagine all of a sudden in 1 year period, you're losing 1/3 of your cybersecurity team, which means you have to hire different people, you have to train them, you have to have them adapted to your environment. So we understood that this high turnover might have had a huge impact on the cybersecurity team and the cybersecurity posture of the Capital One. Okay. And now Nelson will go back here and we will discuss some recommendations to share with you. Okay, thank you very much.
So after a big failure, the most important thing is the learning process. And inside our research, we give you a lot of recommendations that you can apply in your company, in your business, and in your life. So let's see some recommendation of that. So here we have something that is really fast that you can apply next week. So you should review the most recently compliance audit reports. Check with your team, check what you have that can impact your company. So look for potential weakness that you have. Address and fix critical vulnerabilities and focus on cybersecurity best practice. Let's see what is the best practice that you are following. Even if the regulator doesn't mandate it, it's important to check on the market. We have a lot of best practices that you can follow to help you, and we are going to cover some of that. Double check your security controls for cloud computer infrastructure. So a little bit more complex, and for the next month, you should focus on reviewing your vulnerability management process. And with that, you also review your audit process to avoid improper adoption of compliance control. Let's see if the vulnerability management process correlated with the audit can work together to improve the maturity of cybersecurity control that you apply in your company. So need to comply with your global policies for data protection and cybersecurity. For example, the NIST, cybersecurity framework, ISO standards, GDPR, PCI DSS, and a lot of other ones. So apply the best cybersecurity best practice. So you don't need to just apply what is the regulator is mandated to you. We can see around the road that we have a different level of cybersecurity maturity in some kind of markets. So find that one that is most complete to protect your company. So keep the controls relevant as the technology evolves. Every day we have new technologies. Every day we have new threats, and every day we have new vulnerabilities. So take care what kind of new technologies that you are using. And keep strong security principles as defense in depth and the least privilege. Let's see that one audit process is not just a checklist. If you have a security parameter in a specific control, for example, access permission, don't check that. Let's see if you have the correct permission for that. Apply the defense in depth. Something you fail, and if you have two or different layers of protection, you can avoid a big problem. And use the least privilege. You don't need to have more access than you need to do a specific function. And in the 6 months, try to manage the compliance window. The time that you want to audit or internal control team report to you, and how can you establish a connection in a real-time response to help you to keep everything in a risk management approach to protect your company. And here we are saying that you can build a governance operation center. It's a new name that we would like to share with you, a way that you can practice to measure the efficiency of existing compliance controls in real time. You can establish a partnership with audit and internal controls just to use or help them to monitor all those compliance controls in real time. Because normally security operations certain teams are focused on operation and technical control and no visibility on regulator demands. So you can also establish a specific ongoing monitoring and a continuous real-time validation for tactical and compliance controls. As you are using cloud and continuous integration, continuous delivery, you can establish a way to help to identify any vulnerability as soon as possible. And in the end, in the next 6 months, you can help together with your HR team and help your company and your team to have a great leadership, a multidisciplinary team, and help IT and security to work together. Leadership is something that is crucial for any company, mainly for cybersecurity. Build a leadership in the organizational culture to avoid silos, to avoid finger points, and to avoid a toxic environment. Review with your HR team the strategy and the tools that you can help to create the best culture and the best place to work, to build a people-centric culture. Review with your HR team the leadership gap that you have around your company that is going to help you to keep the best talents to work with you. Work on employees' retention policies. That's something that is also going to help you. So I would like to thank you, and thank you, Stuart Mednick, all the MIT and CAMS Institute, and Kizis and Natasha, and thank you everyone for all questions, and we are here to answer all of them. Thank you very much. And our paper is totally available and free, and you can access all the details and more, and you get more information to help you to learn from this incident and to establish new ways to protect your company. Thank you.